Hi, Britlet students. So here I am in a slightly different position in my house. This is like the dining area type place. Um, this cabinet is very, very old. It was my great grandmother's. And many of these are also antiques. I painted that. Isn't that fun? So anyway, welcome to my house once again. I wanted to talk just a little bit about the poetry of first Rupert Brooke and then move a little bit into Siegfried Sassoon, although we may also cover Siegfried Sassoon along with Wilfred Owen a little bit more in the next section. Rupert Brooke, remember, is at the very beginning of the war, never saw combat. So he's still very much in that early mindset that we're going to win this war by Christmas. It's going to be awesome. And death on a battlefield, oh, that's glorious and amazing. So let's all do this. It's great. That's the Rupert Brooke mindset. By the time we get to Siegfried Sassoon and his poetry, which is written in the middle of the war, 1916, 1917, by a man who has fought incredibly bravely, but who has been in the muck and mire and has been surrounded by death in this horrible new scale that no one had predicted. We get to a very different kind of poetry there. So it's an interesting contrast to make. And in fact, that's a really good way to think about these first two poets is in contrast to one another in their themes, in their conception of war. Obviously, they're going to be very different. But then also in the ways that they write. Rupert Brooke is using sonnets, which is a very strict, very traditional kind of poetry. Siegfried Sassoon doesn't always do that. He doesn't stick to really traditional formats. He will have very clear rhythm and rhyme and some things that we identify as traditional poetry, but he's beginning to shift away from some of those more traditional ways of doing poetry. You're going to hear my dog walk past me here in just a second. There she goes. And you might hear her go in and out her doggy door. So just ignore that. She does that a lot. Oh, there she goes. Yeah. Okay. So Rupert Brooke, very traditional ideas about war, very traditional poems. Siegfried Sassoon, slightly different. So I want to point out, there's the doggy door again. I want to just pull one poem from each to kind of show some of this contrast. And then there's going to be a discussion board down below this video where I'm going to pose a question, and I want all of you to reply to me and to each other in ways that you're analyzing some of these poems from Rupert Brooke and Siegfried Sassoon. So the first one I want to look at is in the packet of poems. It's the second one. It's the first Roman numeral of the 5 war sonnets. This one's not considered a war sonnet. I mean, it is a war sonnet, but it's not one of the 5. So this is the number 1 of the 5, and it's called Peace. There are some things I would like for you to pay attention to in this particular sonnet. So if we read it together, it says, "Now God be thanked, who has matched us with his hour, and caught our youth, and wakened us from sleeping, with hand made sure, clear eye, sharpened power, to turn, as swimmers, into cleanness leaping, glad from a world grown old and cold and weary, leave the sick hearts that honor could not move, half men, their dirty songs and dreary, and all the little emptiness of love. Oh, we who have known shame, we have found release there where there's no ill, no grief, but sleep has mending. Not broken save this body, lost but breath. Nothing to shake the laughing heart's long peace there, but only agony, and that has ending. And the worst friend and enemy is but death." There's some interesting things that Brooke does in this particular sonnet. Number 1, he falls very much into that traditional beginning of the war idea of shaming the men who did not sign up immediately and have not immediately gone to war. In the first stanza, he calls them the sick hearts that honor could not move. They have no honor. They haven't been affected in their hearts for this sense of honor and sense of country. So he really falls into that camp that was incredibly shameful towards the men who did not step up or who did not sign up to fight. And in fact, in that first stanza, everything is framed in the sense that this is something that God wants. God has called us. He has wakened us from our sleep, and we are glad for it. He has made us pure and clean, like a swimmer jumping into the clean, clear water. This perception of the glorious battle and the glorious war is not just simply honorable, but it is holy, because God himself is the one who has created this awakening and has brought these men into this honorable position. The second stanza is an interesting one that then turns to the soldiers themselves, and he uses the word we. He's including all the others who have answered this call. And he begins this kind of litany of negatives. There is no ill. There is no grief. Naught, which means nothing. There is nothing broken except for the body. There is nothing lost, well, except for breath. And there's nothing that can shake the heart's peace except for agony. And even that has an ending. And our best friend and enemy is death. So his minimizing what is painful and what is horrific about war by using these continual negative words. There is no ill. There is no grief. I mean, we're not losing anything except for our breath. And we're not really suffering anything except for agony. But all that has an ending. So there's almost this sense of like, well, it's not that bad. And even if you do die, that's an okay thing. And if you look at the way he chooses what words rhyme, so rhyming pairs, in that second stanza, he chooses to rhyme mending and ending. Those are opposites, right? If we mend something, we're bringing it together, we're integrating it. But the ending of life is the ultimate disintegration, the ultimate breaking apart, mending and ending. He also uses a contrast in the rhyme between breath and death. Obviously, opposites. And it's I think it's important that he ends with death, that's the final word of the poem. It is the final word of our lives, obviously, but it's also what the poem is building to. So the first line begins with God, capital G, and the last line ends with death, capital D. These are these personifications of these powers, one being holy that initiates the movement towards war, and then one being the ending, death, which brings all of it together ultimately. In his tone, he's rather hopeful. He's a little encouraging maybe in that second stanza, although the first stanza has quite a bit of shame in it. And he's viewing this in that very traditional beginning of the war way. Okay, so keep that in mind and flip to the poem by Siegfried Sassoon called They. It's the very first one in the Siegfried Sassoon part of the packet. And so listen to this one. It is also talking about soldiers, but it isn't. Okay, yeah, just listen to it. We'll get to that. They by Siegfried Sassoon. The bishop tells us, when the boys come back, they will not be the same, for they'll have fought in a just cause. They lead the last attack on Antichrist. Their comrades' blood has bought new right to breed an honorable race. They have challenged death and they have dared him face to face. We're none of us the same, the boys reply. For George lost both his legs, and Bill is stone blind, and poor Jim's shot through the lungs and like to die, and Bert's gone syphilitic. You'll not find a chap who is served that hasn't found some change. And the bishop said, the ways of God are strange. So this is an interesting conversation kind of poem where we begin with a bishop, a man of God, a man of the church, in particular the Anglican Church. And Sassoon is putting into that bishop the traditional view of war. And he's telling these boys who are coming back from the war and have come back that what they've done is honorable. It's on this grand scale, it's fighting the Antichrist. It's this good versus evil in the most cosmic, ultimate way. And that they have won us the right to breed an honorable race. Like there's this sense of racial purity and nationalism in terms of if we breed more of our good people, then we have more control of the war and the world. So the bishop represents that very nationalistic, uber patriotism that is the kind of the traditional way of viewing World War I. The boys, on the other hand, have a completely different view. And their ultimate view is about change. None of us are the same, they say. And then they list some of the changes. If you've watched the video above about shell shock, there is definitely this sense that because World War I was so different from any war that had come before, and because it was on such a scale that no one could have imagined, the human physical and mental reaction to that kind of violence was one that changed these soldiers for the rest of their lives. And these boys in this poem are mentioning that. The lost legs, the going blind, the syphilis that's been picked up from who knows who in the trenches or in towns with prostitutes. There isn't a holiness to what the boys are saying. There isn't an honor. There isn't this hope that they're going to come back home and breed an honorable race. They're presenting this from a completely different point of view of the bishop. And if you think about it, the bishop wasn't there, right? The bishop's not in war. The bishop, as far as we know, has been there in England at the church. And so he's telling about what happens when these boys come back. So he's there at home. He hasn't experienced this. And the boys who have come back with a completely different point of view and something that the bishop doesn't even hear. Because the end of the poem is the bishop just simply saying, yeah, ways of God are strange, aren't they? He's not even addressing what the boys have brought to him, the way that a bishop or a minister or someone who is part of a church might be expected to listen to and to accept. Instead, the bishop ends the poem with a shrug. Well, God's ways are strange, aren't they? It's an interesting picture in contrast to what Rupert Brooke, in his sonnet piece, had to say about the soldier's understanding of war. In Brooke, the soldiers, the we, there is no ill, there is no grief, and even if we die, that's okay. Versus these soldiers in Siegfried Sassoon's poem, they're a completely different point of view, though they are the same soldiers that Rupert Brooke was writing about in his sonnet. So the tones of the two are really different. The language used is also very different. If you look at the language in Siegfried Sassoon's, it's very simple, it is very straightforward, and it is very vernacular, right? Stone blind. He's gone syphilitic, not he has syphilis or he contracted syphilis. There's a kind of a starker realism to what Sassoon is doing. And that's really a sign of early modernism in literature. The modernist movement wanted to present the world in a very realistic, down and dirty kind of way. And you see that in Siegfried Sassoon's poems. So I'm going to ask you to do some of the same work of comparing a Rupert Brooke poem and a Siegfried Sassoon poem in the discussion board down below. So once you've watched this and you've sort of read and processed the poetry from these two World War I soldiers, let's go ahead and move into the discussion board and see what everyone has to say.